Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Welcome everyone to this podcast with a most distinguished guest. We kind of overuse this term distinguished, just like we overuse the word legend, but in this case, both labels apply, although his modesty may not allow him to agree. We have with us the Sheikh, the eminent professor, Dr. Abu Mina Bilal Phillips. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. How are you doing, Doctor?
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah, I'm fine. Barakallahu fikum. And I pray the same for yourself as well as to our viewers.
Well, Yakum, thank you very much. So, of course, your youthful looks belie the amount of decades of hard work you've put in to serving this religion. Allahumma barik. So we won't do justice to it, of course, in 1 hour or so, 90 minutes. I say 1 hour of a discussion, but we'll do our best. We'll try to pick your brains, as it were, to see if we can reflect on the state of Islam and Dawah around us, and where you think Muslims can benefit and improve the situation. So if we can start with, on a macro level, the big picture, as it were. If you were to look at the lay of the land, the state of the Ummah today, how would you describe the situation there in the West in general and in the Muslim world, which you're familiar with? What comes to mind? What's the first things that come to mind?
Well, what comes to my mind is that the field and the ability to operate within the field has been constricted. You know, with the demonization by the Indian government of Dr. Zakir Naik, for example, and forcing him to leave the country and set up residence elsewhere, canceling his passport and all those other kinds of things. That is the most extreme to the most visible and active da'i on a global scale that's reaching out to people in aspects of dawah through Peace TV. So, that direct attack on him, basically quietening him, putting a seal over his mouth so he can't continue or decrease, forcing him to almost go underground. I mean, that tells us something about the overall status. Because and of course he's not alone. I have been banned from a number of different countries. Attacks have been directed towards me also. I was jailed in the Philippines. Not really jailed. I was held in detention in the Philippines, and all of this a part of the global attempt to silence the dawah, at least on a big scale, where the message is being presented physically in the presence of, many thousands of people, tens of thousands and more. The attempt to restrict that in general, has reached all the various areas of dawah in Western countries, in the English-speaking dawah, as well as other languages in Europe, etc. So there is, a massive amount of pressure being placed on those who are involved in dawah, in that you virtually can't speak about problems which exist in the society and make people aware, because then you are labeled as a hate preacher. For example, I gave some lectures before in the past, back in the 90s, where I addressed, common, we could call them contemporary issues that, keep coming up time and time again, that are being raised about Islam and Muslims and these types of things. And among them is, the issue of homosexuality and how Islam deals with homosexuality. And of course, Hamilton just recently, had to speak out because he's the Formula One racer, driver. He had to speak out against the Saudi Arabian position on homosexuality, that it's a crime, which you could be jailed for, or you could even be executed for. Okay, so I mean, that is a frontal attack on the country. But on the scale of the du'at, those who are calling to Islam, my presentation was basically clarifying Islam's stance, to the arguments that were raised by the homosexuals in defense of homosexuality and this kind of things. I responded to them and explained why we don't accept this, so and so and so. And, of course, yes, the ruling in Islam is such and such, etc. But that explanation made me, or listed me, caused me to be listed in the UK as a hate preacher. And of course, then they're trying to dig up as many other things as possible. And, they came out with this thing, I defend suicide bombing. And they take, from the same series of lectures that I did, and a book was produced for it, for this course in contemporary issues, where I mention about suicide bombing. I explained about in a wartime circumstance, on the battlefield, etc. Right. Acts may be done which even the West refers to as suicide missions. Right. So it's not something uncommon. So in these kind of contexts, but I clearly stated in the article, in the chapter, that where people are blowing themselves and killing up other people, innocent people in airports, in supermarkets, in nightclubs, and I said, this is totally forbidden in Islam. This is evil, So they only took the part where I said that, it is a part of warfare, or something to that effect, right? They took out of context, and then made it seem as if I was giving a blanket, approval to suicide bombing. And that's based on something said back in the 90s. And they're using that, 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later, to accuse me of being of that persuasion and banning me from the UK, etc. So, I'm just giving Dr. Zakir and myself as examples. Dr. Zakir on one global scale, and the attack which came after him, and myself, on a more individual scale. But the same thing, and everybody else now has to walk a tightrope. You have to be very careful about what you say. One of the things they attacked me on was in defense of Prophet Muhammad's marriage to Aisha. I clarified, about it historically and all the different things connected to it, that, this is not something you can't call the Prophet a pedophile. This is not acceptable. No. Because he doesn't fit the mold of a pedophile at all. He married. Pedophiles don't marry children that they abuse, etc., etc. They just abuse them. So it's not so. But in the UK, they had Channel 4, I think it is, underground,
yes,
in the
undercover mosques
in Birmingham, recording me defending the Prophet ﷺ's marriage to Aisha at the age of 9, and bringing her to live with him, at the age of what they said, 13.
Yeah, plus the World Health Organization's definition of pedophilia is prepubescent, whereas what we know of al-Mu'mineen, the mother of the believers, she'd already passed that stage. you have a background, or you used to be into communism, so you'll be aware, of course, of how the communist state operates, and George Orwell's dystopian 1984. It seems like, the band that you're discussing, and almost like thought crimes, like the police in people's minds. Would you say this is due to their, as a knee-jerk reaction without really understanding what they're hearing? Or would you say it's a deliberate attempt because they see the effectiveness and the efficacy of Islamic preaching?
No, I think that it's mainly it is the openness that the secular West has taken. So because they are permitting, remember, now the West and the East, at one point, adultery was a crime. In the West, it's been removed from the law books as a crime. It's not a crime, So the idea that any country is still going to punish people, jail them, kill them, that is, execute them for adultery, this is looked at as being heinous. So you have the permissive West opening up the doors, where even incest is removed from the law books of various countries of Europe. It's not, with a few exceptions. They've removed it. It's no longer a crime, having relations with your mother, your sister, or your daughter, as long as you are consenting adults, because that becomes the determining factor. It's about consent, and you're an adult. You're allowed to do whatever you want to do. So Islam stands in opposition to all of that. So naturally, this clash of civilizations is inevitable. It will clash. The clash will be there on different levels, and this is one of the major levels in the area of morality. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ had said, I was only sent to perfect for you the highest of moral character traits. So Islam is about morality. So naturally, the society that says morality is whatever the majority agree on, whatever the majority agree on as being acceptable, then that is morally okay and defensible. Whereas Islam says, no, the moral principle have been fixed, from the beginning of time. And it's reinforced in the books of Revelation which were sent, whether even you look in the Bible, or the Quran, etc., it's there, fixed. But it's only Islam, as a nation, a global nation, that stands in the way of this open society, which is developing an open culture, and freedom. This freedom is the main focus. So I think on one hand, yes, there is the attitude towards silencing the Dawah because of the spread of Islam. But in the West, the amount of people who are converting to Islam, it's not enough to threaten the whole society. Right. So I don't see that as really so much they are focused on Islam. They're just focused on anything which constricts or restricts or blocks the freedoms which they believe that human beings should have. Western civilization is looked at as being the peak of the pyramid of human civilization. They're at the top, survival of the fittest. So naturally, what brought them to the top? Whatever it is they believe in, this is what took them there. This is how they see it. Of course, we believe that this is the will of Allah. He switches rulership and conquest and ownership, power, as he wishes in the world, as part of the test.
With the slide into decadence and hedonism and the rejection of objective morality, right, is a reversion to mob rule, that this difference between practicing Muslims and the rest of humanity becomes very, very stark, because even practicing Christians, they tend to bend under pressure and cave in on certain things which we would have thought are solid foundational principles for them, to the extent that even in the UK, when some of these issues about certain things getting taught in school in regards to sexual relationships, etc., some of the Christians were praising the Muslims for being at the forefront and saying that we need to follow them, and they almost like, what's the you had the canaries in the coal mine. They would notice there's a gas and they would die quick. So it's like when the Muslims are onto something that this is going to harm your family, then the rest of the world should take note. So do you think there's an opportunity here, whether proactively managed or just naturally, for Muslims, specifically Dawah or callers to Islam and scholars of Islam, to take a leading role for the world at large in terms of having a solid moral grounding?
Well, it is an opportunity, but the question is whether the du'at are able to capitalize on that opportunity, because the opportunity is most accessible to people from the West, who are themselves of, a similar background to those that are propagating these ideas right now. They can have people amongst them speak against or challenge or whatever. But when it's people who are not amongst them, from the Muslim communities and others, when they reach and they try to challenge, then, it's, as they say, all hell breaks loose. They come down on you like a ton of bricks.
And you mentioned that we haven't had the impact in terms of conversions, let's say acceptance of Islam by the a broader section of the West, unlike what happened historically in certain places in Europe, such as Bosnia, Albania, and certain parts of Russia. Although you could say they thought they were for political reasons, or they had a political power behind them. I was speaking to a friend who works on the ground, if you like, in Dawah, with Dawah stalls and training and dealing a lot with non-Muslims. And he mentioned to me recently that this thing about most of, well, I shouldn't speak about Europe, right? But let's say the UK, that most of the working class of the UK atheists, he said that we find when speaking to the working class anyway, the average, non-Muslim, it's not actually true. There's somewhere between agnosticism or actually belief in a God, but their issue is they don't see God has relevance to their lives. So when you question them, they will say, yeah, maybe I think there's someone, it makes sense, an intelligent designer or
Theism.
purpose. Yeah, but they see that there's no connection for them. What does he do for me, right? I've got to go to this soccer game. I'm going to get drunk on the weekend. I've got my work and life to live. And so how do we potentially bridge that gap? How does one make God relevant to a people who feel that they have everything without needing God to give them anything else?
Well, convincing deists, who already believe in God, is obviously much easier than convincing atheists. So, when you have a deist in your sights, or willing to discuss, etc., then it's much easier to bring them to some further reflection that, hey, if you believe that God created us and put us here, he obviously put us here for a purpose, right? I mean,
Right.
So then get them to question themselves. Yeah, there must be a purpose, because it doesn't make sense that an all-powerful, all-knowing God, etc., is just going to create us and leave us to figure it out for ourselves. That would be an exercise in futility, because most people would just not even bother to think about it or whatever. So, you give them logical reasons, examples, etc., which can bring them to the point that, yeah, there must be a reason. Okay, so what are you saying is the reason? Because they don't have a reason. There's no clarity there. Even if they go to church and you ask them, well, what's the reason of our creation? They're going to say, well, I didn't think about it recently. I'd have to think about that one. Whatever. The point is that we can capitalize on those who have a sense of God, of God's creation. And that's why the Quran, all of the arguments of the Quran are to deists. They're not to atheists. There's only a few spots where the Quran talks about, addresses the atheist who doesn't believe even in God at all, because they're a minority. They've always been a minority. The whole world has existed as believers in God from the very beginning. So those who deny God's existence altogether are a very small minority. And that's why the Quran just touches on a few points for them to reflect. But most of the reflection that the Islam and the Quran calls to is for deists to reflect on the message which was brought, the logic that is in it, the idea of worship other than the true God, that this is obviously misguidance and falsehood, etc. And all of these types of arguments to clarify for deists that Islam is the true religion of God.
And what would you say it would take for Islam to become mainstream? We're not necessarily saying the majority, but to reach critical mass whereby it's acknowledged that this is a part of our indigenous culture, not just an immigrant religion, but part of, in this case, British society. It could be any country, non-Muslim country we think of. I mean, we know there's mass conversions do happen in some cases, like particularly in parts of Africa, Malawi, I'm aware of, and other places where, or Philippines, where an entire village or hamlet or group of people, households will convert. And I know that historically you're involved with the US troops stationed in the Gulf, and that you were able to oversee a lot of those, mashallah, conversions. And others have said maybe it requires a Malcolm X moment, right? You need some kind of leader to bring over a whole community. Realistically, what do you think may work, or what we could potentially contribute towards making Islam more mainstream?
Well, I think that if we can, activate the mass of Muslims to realize, the Dawah imperative that, hey, it's a sin for you not to give Dawah. To live with neighbors who know you, play with you, grow up with you, work with you, and all these other things, and you don't say anything to them about Islam. That's a crime. You will be asked on the day of judgment, why didn't you? When the Prophet ﷺ had told us, "Ballighu anni walau ayah," convey whatever you've learned from me, even if it's only one verse of the Quran. So we need to raise that consciousness of Muslims to understand the Dawah imperative, that this is not just if you feel like it, it's good. It's a good thing to do, but you don't really have to do it. No, you have to do it, and you will be held accountable. Allah talks about cursing those who don't, and the angels cursing them, and the whole of humanity cursing them. So, this is not, we have to get across that requirement, that obligation. That's what Jamaat Tabligh, they have made that their, you could say, driving force, getting people to spread Islam. But their focus tends to be on just helping those Muslims who strayed, bringing them back to practicing Islam. But the point is that the dawah has to go beyond that. It's that, as well as to those who haven't heard the message of Islam. And they have even the greater right to receive that message. So it's about activating the community, letting them understand that responsibility, so that whatever position they are in relationship to non-Muslims, they feel it an obligation on themselves to share something of Islam with the people around them.
And in terms of now, of course, we're in the digital age. I mean, we're saying that as if it's something recent, but already it's been a few decades. But certainly it seems that with every few years, a new platform comes up. There was a time when there was MySpace was a thing that died out. Facebook took over. Facebook's changed its name to Meta. Then you had YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. And it seems that people's appetite for these kind of soundbite type of interaction, not necessarily two-way, but downloading and viewing, or even messaging on Twitter, for example. This seems to be something that is for many people, whether lapsed Muslims, as you mentioned, who we want to bring back to religion, or non-Muslims we want to invite to religion. This seems to be the first interface or interaction many people have with religiosity, with Islam. Is that something you've seeing that transition from traditional learning, print publishing, something, of course, that you pioneered very greatly in the English language, at least with Orthodox Sunni knowledge, right now to this modern digital age? Is it being exploited enough? And how should Muslims, particularly those who have classical learning, better engage and exploit these platforms and fora?
Well, my belief is that we now have the means to make the most basic level of Islamic scholarship available to the masses on a scale that has never been seen before, which is the motivating force for me to start the International Open University, which was originally called the Islamic Online University. That's where it started. The idea of providing a platform for people who want to learn about Islam. They didn't have the opportunity while growing up when they went to school, etc., but they want to learn. They want to learn and understand the religion to be able to be more effective in sharing their religion with others. So, I think that the current status of the internet and what opportunities are there is an opportunity to learn knowledge on a scale which was unthinkable 30 years ago, 40 years ago, totally unthinkable. People were still traveling to other parts of the world, like myself, when I accepted Islam in the 70s, not being able to find the knowledge there in North America, or access the knowledge. The books that were available were Qadiani Ahmadi books, mostly, a few writings of Maulana Maududi,
Yeah.
and others. Yeah, so the availability of material was so limited that I had no choice but to leave North America, wanting to understand Islam from its sources, to go to Medina in Saudi Arabia and start to study Arabic formally and go through my courses of study. So today, still, of course, much of the Muslim world wants to go and study in Medina, many. But the reality is that only a few are going to make it there. And in most countries around the world, the availability of top quality or high level Islamic educational institutions are very limited, very few. So with the advent of the internet, this Allah provided for us as a means of making Islam studies, formal studies, accessible to the general masses, to whoever wants it. So this is why, we pioneered in this field, went ahead, and, alhamdulillah, we have students from 229 different countries around the world.
Wow. And you've had many thousands of people pass through that university.
Over 500,000.
Over 500,000. Wow. Wow, subhanAllah. Did you expect that when you started? Surely that number is almost astronomical. What do you put down to its success, if that has surpassed your expectations?
Well, I can't say that I imagined that there would have been 500,000 students who registered with the intent to study. But potentially, I knew that potentially it was there, but that potential is still not realized, because only 10% of that number actually go into the studies, follow through with the full registration and start classes and everything else. And from that 10%, we also still have even dropouts. Maybe about 30% of those who end up registering and actually taking the class, etc. About 30% of them now, drop out before the number higher.
It sounds like a real university then, because that's the kind of thing that happens, right? People drop out.
Yeah.
Subhanallah. And what about the actual curriculum itself, the actual subjects? Do you find that that's also had to change with the times and with these issues that you mentioned, these controversies that whether the Western liberalism or whoever it might be might interfere or impose certain constraints? Do you have to factor that in terms of teaching, or is it the fact that because it's online, you're kind of free from those restrictions?
Well, basically, as you said, we're free from those restrictions. I mean, but what we have done from another perspective is that, in order to ensure, if we focus on the Islamic studies side, our Sharia program, that students who study with us should graduate fully equipped to benefit their community. What was happening with students graduating from Medina in the thousands, yearly, thousands and thousands graduating every year, going back to the communities, but they were, as I would call it, half-baked. They came back, yes, they had a bachelor's in Sharia, but then people asked them to counsel families, divorce issues, all these other kinds of things where they were called upon, but they had no training in counseling. They were asked to be teachers. Okay, we're going to put you as the head of the school, of our local school, and you teach, and etc., etc. But they weren't trained teachers. They didn't know how to teach. We have finances and finance problems, etc. And we need to, but they didn't study Islamic banking and finance. We need you to do this and that on the computer. They didn't study computers. They didn't, and so on and so forth. There are key areas of knowledge today which need to be incorporated in the Islamic universities. So the student graduates with a wide range of skills and knowledge. So that's why for our program, our bachelor's program, we included education. Student has to take so many courses in education. They have to take so many courses in psychology, counseling, etc. They have to take so many courses in IT. They have to take courses in Islamic economics, and so on and so forth. So we tried to add these other areas which I felt were critical areas of learning that graduates need to to have had a holistic approach to Islamic education. So, on one hand, we gave these additional subjects to our Sharia graduates, and then on the other hand, these additional subjects, which were important in and of themselves, we turned them now into degree programs. And degree programs which would be or should be taught from an Islamic perspective. So I was directly involved in handpicking, choosing professors to teach the various subjects in these, we could say, modern subjects, the courses in these modern subjects, making sure that they were capable. They had enough Islamic knowledge to guide them in the course of teaching their various subjects. There are going to be areas where there are shady areas, no doubt, because morality has been taken out of education. This is the secularization of education in the West. Morality is taken out. There's no morality. Morality is whatever your people at that time in that place say is morally okay. So it's, you learn without morality. So we need to put morality back into education. So obviously in the Islamic Studies department, we don't need to do that because it's an intrinsic part. But in the other areas, whether it's psychology or Islamic bank and finance, in education, in all of the various, because we're introducing, we just introduced agricultural economics.
Oh, wow.
And we're introducing also public health and mass communications. All these areas have Islamic guidelines, and so we want to make sure that the teaching staff would be conveying, clarifying for the students, not just teach it as it is. You can do this, you can do that, you can do the other. No, but there are things here which you cannot do, even though the skill or the area allows you to do it. Islam doesn't allow you to do it. And why doesn't Islam allow you to do it? Because of so and so. So the students are not just told haram, don't touch it, leave it, carry on. No. But why? Why is Islam opposed to this form of teaching or understanding? Why is the best salesman not the man who is able to sell snowballs to Eskimos,
right?
Or sand to desert Arabs? Why isn't that the best salesman? Because for them to do it, they had to deceive those people. How can you sell sand to somebody sitting and living in the middle of, a desert, a sand desert? You get him to buy sand from you. You have to deceive him. And deception is not allowed in Islam. And so on and so forth.
In the West, more specifically than, let's say, many Eastern countries, the obviously overriding culture is individual liberty. And so many Muslims maybe have a skewed perception of what they should and should not perhaps get involved in as Muslims. So we have this broad umbrella term of activism. Of course, you have a history of activism in some ways. That's you came to Islam via communism, or rather, you were communist, interested in communism before Islam. So you've lived in both worlds. And what would you say about this kind of this split of focus?
Well, we need both. As simple as that. If we don't have political activism to defend our rights and protect Muslim communities, etc., then we'll be overwhelmed. We have to have voices that can stand up, and these voices, to be able to stand up in these circumstances, obviously they have to make some compromises, because otherwise you won't even get a chance to say anything, So they may have to go along with this and go along with that. And of course, people then attack them, those who are Islamic, concerned with education and these kind of things. They attack those people. Look what they're in a party. You know what the constitution of that party says?
Right.
They have agreed to this stuff, so they're useless. Don't even, no, that's not the point. If in an ideal world, yeah, they should be able to say this without having to make any compromises. But we're not living in that ideal world. We're living in a corrupted world.
Right.
A world where, it's not in our hands. People like Erdogan, who's going to stand up and, defend Islam verbally and physically in the way that he has done, he's a rarity. The mass of the Muslim world today now is just submerged. Neo-colonialism is reality. The wealth of the countries is still being plundered, but just under rulers that are, for the most part, in the pocket or the pockets of the colonial masters. So, I mean, that situation hasn't really changed. So for us, for Muslims in the West especially, to be able to tackle some of the issues, the dangerous issues, then they have to have, some political means to put them in a position to defend, to protect, to prevent harm from the Muslim community as a whole. And, as much as we may not like what kind of constitutions the various parties have, and what is in those constitutions, and for you to be able to get a platform to be able to speak, you have to tick on this and turn a blind eye to it so that you can speak. This is the realities that they have to face, Allah on. Allah knows their intention. We pray that Allah protects them, and that they can create a future where our generations to come, Muslims, will not have to make the kind of compromises that they've had to make.
And in that regard of compromise and moving forward and unity, one of the things that blights unity and progress in the political sphere or in religious preaching are, let's say, crass sectarian disputes. Because, of course, we acknowledge, right, that there has to be a distinction between Tawheed and Shirk and Sunnah and Bid'ah. But at the same time, or rather, what complicates that is when people get embroiled in petty fighting of legitimate differences, but they make them issues of splitting. And of course, everyone who spent any years engaging in that will have been affected by this or been pulled into it. Yourself, of course, as well. I know there was this text that you translated, General Issues of Faith, which was authored by Sheikhs such as Sheikh Ali al-Halabi, Musa Nasr, rahimahullah, and those scholars. And it dealt with one of these controversies which kind of got imported into the West. I mean, we don't need to get into the issue itself of the distinction between actions and iman and the relationship between the two. But that was one thing where you saw people splitting over issues that they really should not have been splitting. And hence, I guess one of the benefits and the motivations of that book is to say, look, this isn't an issue that deserves or justifies, warrants splitting between the community. So how does one navigate between that, between being distinct and clear, quote unquote, a term which gets overused, clear in one's methodology at the one hand, and not being myopic, inward looking, backward almost in crass sectarian disputes?
Well, I think that we have to be clearly focused on the goals. The goals, or the main goal, is to spread Islam in its original purity. Now, you may not be able to do that right at the very beginning. It may have to go in stages, and you have to be prepared to be patient and work with those who want to achieve similar ends, etc. That compromise where your basic principles of Islam are not being compromised among Muslims, is something which Muslims were called to and had to do in various times through the history of the Islamic empires and states, etc. So this ability to keep focused on the main goal and doing what is necessary to be able to achieve that goal without compromising uh, foundational principles. This is a tightrope that the da'i has to walk, because if, as people were saying, oh, Bilal Phillips, he sits uh, on the stage with Ikhwanis or with Jamati Islamis or with Tablighis, etc., where I've been invited to give a talk. And of course, my talk will, try to address issues that's beneficial to the community, and call to unification on the Quran and the Sunnah. This is the essence of the message. But the fact that you sit with them and you're talking to their people, no, you should just go to the practicing Muslim communities. This is where you should be, as they call it, preaching to the choir. This is, it's just, these matters have just not been thought out, properly. It's not properly understood. So, of course, those who have that greater understanding, that wider understanding, they have to be patient, as these people will pop up and attack you, take pot shots at you and whatever. You just have to be patient with it. And that's one of the reasons too why I let my focus be in the area of education, because this is where I felt most comfortable as a lecturer, a teacher, etc. And in this area, there's so much that you can do. There's so much. Allah has blessed that relationship between the teacher and the student. In the well-known hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ said that this world is cursed, ad-dunya mal'una, and whatever in it is also cursed, except for the remembrance of Allah and what helps you to remember Allah, and the teacher and the student. This relationship, either we should be a teacher, a scholar, or we should be the student of a teacher or scholar. We should, because if you're not, if you're a scholar, then your responsibility is to teach what you've learned. As Prophet ﷺ had said, that the best of you are those who learn the Quran and teach it to others. So that teaching is what elevates it to the higher level. And teaching actually is an area that has been widely neglected amongst Muslims. I've been to so many countries and visited so many Islamic schools, etc. And in many of these countries where there are where Muslims are in a minority or whatever, or non-Muslims dominate the educational systems, etc. What you find is that in many of these schools, half the teaching staff, or more than half, are non-Muslims. I asked them why. Why? Because we can't find any Muslims who are qualified to teach. So it's a real problem, because teaching is looked down on. It's a profession which is looked down. If you can't get into engineering and medicine, or dentistry or whatever, okay. If you can't get into any of this, okay, become a teacher. It's like last resort for survival. So of course it means that the quality of those going into teaching are, the bottom of the barrel. They couldn't get any jobs elsewhere in the other fields or further studies or whatever. Right. So they rely on teaching. And, as they say, garbage in, garbage out. So, if your teaching staff are garbage, their qualifications are garbage qualifications, then that's the students are going to be producing from that institution will be garbage students. Yeah, they got the marks, they got the A's, B's, whatever, but did they really get an Islamized education? No. So this is a big challenge that the Muslim world is facing today. It's one of the reasons why we added, education as one of our disciplines, our faculties, colleges, because we do need to upgrade our approach to education, to producing teachers who are highly skilled and Islamically conscious, so that they can impart whatever knowledge they're going to teach from an Islamic perspective. Also, even in the area of memorization of the Quran and its teaching. This is an area which, I've come to understand, needs a lot of focus, especially today. Because in many schools, madrasas around the world, children are being abused, beaten by the qurra, the qaris, the teachers, beating them, turning them off to the Quran and to Islam, actually, what comes with it. If you go to any of the sites on, apostatesfromislam.com, you listen to or you read their stories, all of them talk about, we used to get beaten to learn the Quran. It's just, it's a common feature. So this is a sickness which has crept up on the Ummah and has become so, fossilized and deep rooted that you can't. It's very difficult to break it. I mean, I've tried to speak with groups of, teachers of Quran and told them, listen, you have to teach without the stick. You need to put aside the stick. This thing is dangerous. It is destroying a big chunk of our Ummah. You have to stop. They say, no, how can you teach without the stick? I said, it's destroying. But they say, we're okay. We studied through the system. We came out, look at us. We're fine. We don't have any complexes. We don't have any issues. And hey, okay, you came through okay. But what about the other 10 who didn't? Out of every 10, 9 out of the other 9 out of the 10 that you were in, who didn't? That's we don't see that. We only see those who came through. He's Hafiz, he's the Sheikh, he's the Qari, Maulana Sahib, whatever. But huge damage is being done. So one of the things that we have incorporated, in IOU, that we're finalizing it now as a degree qualification, a degreed or certified qualification, that because we have a program in what we call Tahfidh program, which provides an ijaza, which is the standard way it's been going on for centuries. You get the ijaza after you've been checked out, all of your recitation of the whole of the Quran. But now, and technically speaking, the ijaza is, an ijaza bir riwaya, a permission. Ijaza is like a permit, to convey what you have learned, as having memorized the Quran and properly, and etc., with proper tajweed, etc. But are you a qualified teacher? Yeah, you can have that ijaza, but put you in a group of kids that you have to teach, and you're throwing things at them, your shoe or whatever, when they won't quiet down, and it could be chaos. So what we're developing is what we would call a ijaza teaching certificate. So the student who completes the ijaza, along with his completion of the ijaza, he has to study 12 subjects from the College of Education, which puts them in the proper frame of mind. So they come out with an educational teaching qualification, which would then, inshallah, make them better teachers and protect them from falling into that, negative category of those who ignorantly abuse our youth, our young children. How many of my friends as adults told me about how they had to run away from the, from the madrasa, and parents would bring them back, and they would, next thing again, they run away. I remember visiting one madrasa that had brought students from the West, and they were being taught, there in the Gambia. And the brothers who were running the program, a number of them, they had relatives in the West who sent money to set up the school and all this. And they're trying to set up an ideal tahfiz school, notch above a couple of notches above the other schools that were there. Right. But the institution got burnt down twice.
Wow.
And they're wondering what happened, And I told them, listen, you know what I suspect? Because after going through and talking to some of the kids, I said, I think it's the kids burning down the madrasa.
Goodness.
This a'udhu billah, because although yes, they improved the living standard, maybe the food in there, the building, but the same teachers that were teaching in the other madrasas, which are of lower standard, etc., are teaching in the same madrasa.
Right.
So, so maybe people from the East are more tolerant, of that kind of whacking and, hitting and all this other kind of stuff. Whereas kids that have gone to school in the West, these schools were set up for people to send their children, to take a year off school. They've already been in school and studying, etc. They take a year off school, they go back, they learn the Quran, and they come back again, right? This was the plan. But, they had so much difficulty in getting the children to adjust, who had been exposed to Western education, to adjust to the traditional, method of teaching. When I told the Quran teachers that, the sign that they have over the teaching colleges in the West, there's a big sign, which many of them have, which when you go in there, it says, make learning fun. So now when I mentioned that to Quran teachers, how can you make learning the Quran fun?
Oh
that's just unthinkable. Because you're torturing these kids to learn the Quran. So how can you make that fun? It may be fun for you, whacking them and jump, but for the kids, how can you make it fun for them? So this is the mentality that we have to challenge. We have to correct it. We have to protect our youth and give them the proper access to reliable Islamic knowledge, and bring them through with a moderate perspective, able to deal with people from different walks of life, not an exclusionist mentality where they don't have anything to do with these people or those people or this one or that one, but to know their responsibility of dawah, to convey the knowledge that they learned in the best way.
I guess a lot of what you're discussing or what you're indicating is the problem of critical thinking, or people not thinking for themselves, or not being encouraged even and allowed to think for themselves. And that's, if I could take it now right back to where we first became introduced to Dr. Abu Mian Bilal Phillips publishing. Your books were, to be frank, were somewhat revolutionary in that they weren't just a translation of a text. There was few translations back in the day anyway, few and far between. But they also evidenced an author writing, speaking to his audience with cultural references. I mean, one thing, I remember, for example, when the first of your book I read, was your first book, Fundamentals of Tawheed. And it was the first time I came across these terms, Tawheed Asma wa Sifat, Tawheed Uluhiyya, Rububiyyah. And it was a struggle because, the first time it's like a foreign language, right? And how to process it and understand. And then later on, you'd see Shirley MacLaine being referenced, right? And some experience that she felt she had with the other side, the spirit world. And it kind of made it real, because you could relate to popular culture. And at the same time, you're getting a vast amount of education within the cover of that book. So you obviously, I guess you consciously made that decision not to do a pure translation of an existing classical text, but to adapt it for a Western audience. So speak to that, please, if you will.
Well, as a teacher, and having experienced being in the classroom and the need for clarification, and bringing understanding to the students, it was clear to me that, as I I began writing in the early 80s and started publishing by the mid to late 80s, that uh, that was the way to go, because my responsibility as I saw it then was to convey the knowledge which I had gained from having studied in Medina for at that time 6 years, 5, 6 years, and now teaching, studying, doing my master's in Riyadh, that my duty was to take the knowledge which I had gained and convey it to people who didn't have access to that knowledge. So putting it in their language, in the language they could understand, and in the context that they were living, and the cultural experience that they grew up with, etc., this was critical. So I understood that from the very beginning. I mean, there were still some classical texts which I did translate, but these were on particular topics. And even with those translations, I would write, extensive commentaries which would bring those points to the the current or cultural circumstances of people in the West. Because of course my main concern was Muslims in the West. So I would always try to take things back and make it understandable from a Western background. And I realized that was essential. And so all of my writings, lectures, etc., have been from that perspective.
And over the course of this discussion, you mentioned the clash of civilizations, and you wrote about that. You mentioned presenting people the purpose of life, and you wrote about that. So it seems that you've been conscious of gaping holes, if you like, in people's knowledge base or in what's required for them to put strings to their bow of how to apply their faith through their actions. Is there any theme or topic, if you had the time, you'd like to research or get into, or perhaps even translate?
Well, I'm currently working on the 99 names of Allah. I'm giving live uh, YouTube lectures. I'm nearing the end. I'm just finished off, I think, name 83. So there's another, 16 left. This area, is a massive area which we have very little writings on in English. In Arabic, people have written encyclopedias on this, but in English, we don't have much. And direct translation from Arabic in a lot of cases, is, you wouldn't be able to follow it. People, it would just be confusing for them. Those things which have been written, a few writings like Dr. What's his name again now? Dr. Ashkar, yeah. Dr. Suleiman Al-Ashkar. His is he has brought across the names and something about the names in the sense that focused mostly on the different verses in which the names are mentioned, and then giving a brief translation with commentary on those verses. But actually going into the implementation of those names, like if you go to Sufi sites, you can find such things, like what relevance does these names have? Of course, they're giving formulas. If you say 10,000 times after Fajr and you fast for 3 days, etc., this will happen for you, and that will happen, and you'll be elevated these many stations or whatever. They have, but they have their whole body of literature on this kind of stuff. But we need legitimate. So what I did was, I first explained about the 99 names and went into it, and Allah's greatest name, and then went through the names, name by name, using the plan for application devised by Imam Ibn Battal, 12th century Cordovan scholar. So he also did the first commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, which Ibn Hajar has also taken a lot of his information from. Anyway, the point is that he laid down 4 basic principles, and so I applied used these principles to determine, how the names should be applied, right? And going into the derivation of the names and their linguistic status, etc., issues like that. Section is given to each area, and then going in at length with evidences from Quran, Sunnah, etc., and writings of early scholars, Ibn al-Qayyim and others, to give a full, presentation on each name. So, each name, for the most part, is covered in approximately, you could round it off, say, in about 8 to 10 pages. So it gives a person goes in there, they come out, with a full presentation of that name, as it is understood relative to Allah, relative to us as human beings, etc. How can we implement this name in our lives? What is the principles that we should follow? Etc. So this is hopefully, inshallah, Allah will allow me to live long enough to complete it. But I hope, the beginning of next year in January or February, we should be able to publish it. So this is one area I felt. I mean, I've been on it for about the last 10 years, off and on. I've done programs on Huda TV and also on Sharjah TV on the 99 names, but shorter versions and on limited names. I never completed it. So when I got stuck with COVID in Ethiopia in 2020, I gathered up what I'd done before and tried to see if I could complete the 99 names there. So that process began from there. It's extended here this Ramadan, this just past Ramadan of this year. I also started again revising what had been done back in Ethiopia and before, expanding on it, and deciding to stick with it until I finish it. So this is, one major project which which I hope to finish and benefit the Ummah with. There are other writings and projects that I'm engaged in. One of the things I wanted to do, and I've been wanting to do, was a translation of the Quran. Right? And I mean, there's so many of them out there. Of course, we say, "Oh, why do we need another translation?" But again, you can see from the translations there that the Western mind, to a large degree, is not addressed. So there are issues there in the translation because people have sought to be true to the Arabic. But the point is that being true to the Arabic, being expressed in English to non-Arabs, there is a gap.
Yeah, you lose readability for starters.
Yeah, readability. If you go like Mohsin Khan's,
oh my God, that's
all these bracketed stuff, and
very difficult to read.
Or even Yusuf Ali, Muhammad Ali, it's archaic English, and and then all of this other stuff there, But I mean, even something so basic as the royal we,
Hmm.
which people constantly ask about. New converts to Islam, people who converted to Islam years ago but never had a chance to have this explained to them. It remains there. Allah refers to himself as we. Is it Allah and the angels? Is that what we means? What is it? Because of course the Christians would say, hey, this is the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost. That's the
Right.
we.
Right.
Three in one. So that can simply be resolved by just making it singular. Remove all the we's. How can you? That's not being true to the Arabic. The Arabic says nahnu. Nahnu in Arabic means we. But what does the tafsir tell you about this we? It tells you it is Allah saying I. But in order to give weight to the I, it is pluralized, like saying salam alayka,
Yeah.
peace be on you. That's literally you
Yeah.
one. But we don't say that, although you can. Perfectly okay. Salam alayka. Everybody says what? Salam alaykum. But it's just one person you're talking to. Kum means you all. But you and your angels? Is that what is this? You understand what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
So in English, salam alaikum has to be translated as peace be on you, not you all. Because you're talking to one person, unless you're talking to a group. So, that distinction, it's the norm for Arabic. And people don't even think about it. It's not a question in their mind. But for people who are dealing in English, when Allah says we, it boggles their mind. Mind-boggling. Why? Why is Allah using we and us? Why? That can be removed simply. But nobody has done it or is ready to do it. To take the heat that would come from changing we to I. So it means that there's still a need. Need a Quran that people minds will not be played with and confused, etc., over this petty issue, which can so easily be dealt with. So that's just one example, and there are other things, of course, in the Quran which has been commonly translated this way or that way, and it needs to be re-expressed. So that thought has come back to me again. I was gonna do it maybe about 5 years ago, 10 years ago. I was thinking about doing it. Even before that, back in the 90s, it was proposed and people tried to arrange. But then I got busy in the 90s with the Dawah situations, setting up Dawah centers in UAE and 2000s. Sending it up in Saudi as well as UAE and also in Qatar, etc. So just too many things basically stopped me from doing that. But otherwise, that plan was back in the early 90s.
So inshallah, the world looks forward to Dr. Bilal's eventual Quran translation, inshallah. Well, you've been very generous with your time, so I will just ask you one more question, a reflective question then. If you were to look back, if you were to speak, let's say, to your younger self after you became a Muslim back in the day, what advice would you give yourself?
Really, I would advise myself to perhaps be more patient. Because, as they say, haste makes waste. And the haste to try to achieve certain goals, etc., ended up wasting time and energy at different points along the way. Perhaps it's the destiny. Allah is qadar. There are lessons to be learned, and you just had to learn it anyhow. School of hard knocks. But I would say that is something we do need in the dawah, patience in our lives. And as the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever has been blessed with patience, he has been blessed with a great gift from Allah. And I mean, I've tried to be patient, but impatience is, as Allah said, وَخُلِقَ الْإِنسَانُ عَجُولًا. Human beings were created with a hasty nature. That's us.
SubhanAllah. Very poignant advice that we all need to, of course, pay attention to. And as we close, we would advise everyone who hasn't studied Islam, and even if they have, but they want to add some extra modules to their repertoire, do enroll at the
International Open
University. Okay, International Open University. There'll be links abound, I'm sure, on everyone's platforms. And of course, the books have stood the test of time. From the beginning, they were the only books, in fact, we would feel comfortable with, until you kind of set the scene, if you like, trailblazing and pioneering. And subhanAllah, still they're on everyone's recommended reading list as essential text in English language. SubhanAllah, so great benefit, as well as, of course, lectures. I look forward myself, now that I've learnt about it, to the 99 Names of Allah lectures. So SubhanAllah, you've had a great impact in the dawah, in literature, in online teaching, in actual teaching, and of course, so many other projects that you've been involved in.
I'd just like to add, perhaps, one project which we are currently working on, which may be of interest to our viewers or listeners, and that is our 1 million scholarships for African youth, for Muslim African youth, where the continent, like other developing parts of the world, lag behind in the area of education. Access to higher education is just not there. You're talking about less than 10% of high school graduates finding places in universities. So, we've been very active in trying to promote the IOU, the International Open University, as an opportunity for those who don't have the means to access higher education to be able to study for free, if they are in the category of those who have the right to receive zakah. So we have provided, besides the fact that the school fees at IOU in any case are extremely low, as low as you can go. Still, there are people, even with those extremely low fees, many who still can't afford it. So we have, regular campaigns, raising funds for the scholarships of such students. And we have set up over 20 centers, learning centers, we call them, across Africa, east, west, north, south. And, because just giving a student a scholarship is not enough. You have to give them a computer. You have to give them electricity. You have to pay for internet. You need to put them in a classroom. All of this comes along with it. It's a big project, and we hope that it will continue to grow. And we've got thousands of students now studying in this program, and we pray that we'll reach the million mark and beyond in the years to come, soon, inshallah. So anyone who would like to participate, it's on the website. You can go there in terms of projects, charitable projects, etc. You can find the page where it's explained, etc. And or if you have a school, you're from the continent and you have a school and you'd like to open up a learning center there for people of your village or your town or your region, do contact us, because we do this as a collaborative project where we take benefit from existing Islamic schools or institutions, who can provide space or necessary equipment, computers, etc. Inshallah, for us to achieve this goal in the near future.
Inshallah. Let's hope that people will enroll that and breach that. It will go well beyond the 1 million figure. So all that remains then is to say, Jazakallah khair. May Allah reward you, Sheikh Dr. Abu Mina Bilal Phillips, for your time and your efforts. And also to the viewers, thank you for listening and tuning in. And we hope to be visiting you again soon, online at least. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.